Welcome back to Teaching the American Tradition. We will go forth in studying Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, beginning with Chapter 1. As I mentioned in my last lecture, Pym, from the very beginning of the chapter, establishes his identity as an everyman, in contrast to the Society of Gentlemen from Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, in the preface. Um, as he mentions on page 9, my name is Arthur Gordon Pym. My father was a respectable trader in sea stores at Nantucket, where I was born. My maternal grandfather was an attorney in good practice. He was fortunate in everything and had speculated very successfully in stocks of the Edgarton New Bank, as it was formerly called. He's an everyman. Um, he is modestly provided for by his family, sent to grammar school by his grandfather, ends up going to a boarding school of such. But even his grammar school that he attends, there's this man named Mr. Ricketts, who is the head of the school. He's kind of an eccentric. He has one arm. He's kind of an old sea salt, it seems. Um, so very interesting. He's not sent to a very prestigious grammar school or boarding school. He's thrust into society with other everymen from Nantucket, people like himself whose families are kind of in the shipping and mercantile business. Um, while he's at school, Pym becomes acquainted with Augustus Barnard when he's at his secondary school. So at the age of 16, he goes off to secondary school. Um, Augustus's father is a sea captain, and Arthur Gordon Pym shares a bed with Augustus. This is not a this is something that Ishmael does in Moby Dick in the first 100 pages. He shares a bed with Queequeg. This is not something that's out of the ordinary for people in the 19th century. A bed was a luxury for adults, let alone for children. So Pym and Augustus share a bed, and they stay up late at night talking about sea stories constantly. Um, Mr. Beginning on page 9, it's written, Mr. Barnard is also very well known in New Bedford and has many relations, I am certain, in Edgarton. His son was named Augustus, and he was nearly 2 years older than myself. He had been on a whaling voyage with his father in the John Donaldson, and was always talking to me of his adventures in the South Pacific Ocean. I used frequently to go home with him and remain all day and sometimes all night. We occupied the same bed, and he would be sure to keep me awake until almost light, telling me stories of the natives of the island of Tinian and other places he had visited in his travels. So he's captivated by these stories that his friend, who's a few years older than him, tells him. Stays up until almost daylight, hearing these stories of wild adventures in the Pacific Ocean and foreign seas. Through this process, Pym's desire to go to sea swells. He really wants to go out to the ocean. Um, Pym remarks that at last I could not help being interested in what he said, and by degrees I felt the greatest desire to go to sea. Mr. Pym, be careful what you wish for. You will soon be at sea. So Pym and Augustus then attend a party at Mr. Barnard, Augustus's father's house, and become not a little intoxicated toward the close of it. They return home to go to sleep, and Augustus rises about an hour later. On page 10 and 11, it reads, He went to sleep, as I thought, very quietly, it being near 1 when the party broke up, and without saying a word on his favorite topic. It might have been half an hour from the time of our getting into bed, and I was about falling into a doze, when suddenly he started up and swore with a terrible oath that he would not go to sleep for any Arthur Pym in Christendom, when there was so glorious a breeze from the southwest. I never was so astonished in my life, not knowing what he attended, and thinking that the wines and liquors he had drunk had set him entirely beside himself. So Augustus jumps out of bed, and he realizes that there's a great wind in the air, and it would be great weather for sailing. So after this, Augustus attests that he is sober. He says He says he was only tired, he added, of lying in bed on such a fine night like a dog, and was determined to get up and dress and go out on a frolic with the boat. I can hardly tell what possessed me, but the words were no sooner out of his mouth than I felt a thrill of the greatest excitement and pleasure, and thought his mad idea one of the most delightful and reasonable things in the world. It was blowing almost a gale, and the weather was very cold, it being late October. So these boys are set to go on an adventure in the middle of the night to go out to sea and to test these great winds. One problem about going out on a frolic with the boat. The problem is that Pym doesn't really know how to sail. Augustus knows how to sail, being 2 years Pym's senior. We will see what happens. Once they finally get out to sea, um, Pym begins to plead with Augustus. Augustus tells him, "I am going to sea. You may go home if you think proper." Then, turning my eyes upon him, I perceived at once that in spite of his assumed nonchalance, he was greatly agitated. I could see him distinctly by the light of the moon. His face was paler than any marble, and his hand shook so excessively that he could scarcely retain hold of the tiller. I found that something had gone wrong, and became seriously alarmed. At this period I knew little about the management of a boat, and was now depending entirely upon the nautical skill of my friend. The wind, too, had suddenly increased, as we were fast getting out of the lee of the land. Still I was ashamed to betray any trepidation, and for almost half an hour maintained a resolute silence. So, what's going on here? Well, as you can see from the description of Augustus, he looks like a sort of monster. He goes from being bedfellow, friend, close friend to Pym, to a monster in almost a moment in uh, in in the light of the moon that's casting down. This description is a great example of characterization in American Gothic story. These kinds of descriptions you'll see in Sleepy Hollow. If you've read other instances, if you've read other stories from Poe, Poe does this all the time. Turns the familiar into monstrous, usually by the moonlight as well. So at this point in this first chapter, Poe has set the story up so that we realize the worst nightmare of the self-reliant American. Pym is out at sea, in a gale, no means of navigating for himself. He is totally reliant on his friend's techne, or art, because he has no art. He can't sail himself. He is totally naked to the chaos of nature while it's at its greatest strength. The wind is picking up even more. He's beginning to realize that he's in a gale. So he is naked to the abuses and the chaos of nature. He has no friend. What is going to happen? It gets even worse. On page 13 it says, "The whole truth now flashed upon me. I flew to him and raised him up. He was drunk, beastly drunk. He could no longer either stand, speak, or see. His eyes were perfectly glazed, and as I let him go in the extremity of my despair, he rolled like a mere log into the bilge water from which I had lifted him." So it turns out that Augustus is very, very drunk. What shall happen? Pym goes on to say, "It is hardly possible to conceive the extremity of my terror. The fumes of wine lately taken had evaporated, leaving me doubly timid and irresolute. I knew that I was altogether incapable of managing the boat, and that a fierce wind and strong ebb tide were hurrying us to destruction. A storm was evidently gathering behind us. We had neither compass nor provision, and it was clear that, if we held our present course, we should be out of sight of land before daybreak." So they could get stranded at sea, even if Pym can keep the boat afloat, even if he can manage to navigate it. How might he be saved? Well, He manages and he resolves to take matters into his own hand. He grabs the tiller. On page 14, I took the helm and breathed with greater freedom as I felt that there yet remained to us a chance of ultimate escape. Augustus still lay senseless in the bottom of the boat, and as there was imminent danger of his drowning, the water being nearly a foot deep just where he fell, I contrived to raise him partially up and uh, keep him in a sitting position by passing a rope round his waist and lashing it to the ring bolt in the deck of the cuddy. Having thus arranged everything as well as I could in my chilled and agitated condition, I recommended myself to God and made up my mind to bear whatever might happen with all the fortitude in my power. So he recommends himself to God. He relies on his fortitude. He takes resolution. He summons some courage. He decides to lash his friend up so he doesn't drown, and he hopes that he can manage to keep it afloat. What will happen? Again, one of the techniques that Poe uses in Gothic literature, American Gothic literature tends to use, suspending us. Suspending us in this question. What will happen next? How can it get worse? How will the hero survive? How will the protagonist survive? Directly after Pym's prayer, on page 15, he states, "Hardly had I come to this resolution when suddenly a loud and long scream or yell, as if from the throats of 1,000 demons, seemed to pervade the whole atmosphere around and above the boat. Never while I live shall I forget the intense agony of terror I experienced at that moment. My hair stood erect on my head. I felt the blood congealing in my veins. My heart ceased utterly to beat, and without having once raised my eyes to learn the source of my alarm, I tumbled headlong and insensible upon the body of my fallen companion." What are these demons? Again, we're suspended in this sort of question. What's going on? We can't fully trust our senses in this story. There's a sort of mystery in the air. In this experience, we're completely caught off guard. We're toppled, just as Pym and Augustus are. Well, Pym ends up waking up. And upon waking up, he finds himself, upon reviving, in the cabin of a large whaling ship, the Penguin, bound to Nantucket. Several persons were standing over me, and Augustus, paler than death, was busily occupied in chafing my hands. Upon seeing me open my eyes, his exclamations of gratitude and joy excited alternate laughter and tears from the rough-looking personages who were present. By miracle, directly following this prayer, Pym is rescued by the larger boat, the Penguin. Upon coming to, the mystery is revealed to Pym. Was it demons? No. It was simply a boat that ran over them. And how were they saved? On page 16, it describes how they were saved. It wasn't a scream that arose from the deck. There was a slight grating sound to be heard mingling with the roar of wind and water as the frail bark, which was swallowed up, rubbed for a moment along the keel of her destroyer. But this was all. It wasn't demons. It was just nature. Thinking our boat, which it will be remembered was dismasted, some mere shell cut adrift as useless, the captain, ETV Block of New London, was proceeding on his course without troubling himself further about the matter. Luckily, there were two of the lookouts who swore positively to having seen some person at our helm and represented the possibility of yet saving him. A discussion ensued when Block grew angry, and after a while said that it was no business of his to be externally watching for eggshells, that the ship should not put about for any such nonsense, and if there was a man run down, it was nobody's fault but his own. He might be drowned and damned, or some language to that effect. Henderson, the first mate, now took up the matter. being justly indignant, as well as the whole ship's crew, at a speech evincing so base a degree of heartless atrocity, he spoke plainly, seeing himself upheld by the men, told the captain he considered himself a fit subject for the gallows, and that he would disobey his orders if he were hanged for it. The moment he set his foot on shore, he strode aft, jostling Block, who turned very pale and made no answer, on one side, and seizing the helm, gave the word in a firm voice, "Hard alee!" The men flew to their posts, and the ship went cleverly about. All this had occupied nearly 5 minutes, and it was supposed to be hardly within the bounds of possibility that any individual um, could be saved, allowing any to have been on board the boat. So, is it miracle? Is it demons? Is it miracle? Or is it just good men and a natural happening? We're still suspended in this question. To what extent should we account the happenings of this story to miracle, to the supernatural, and to what extent should it just be sort of normal occurrence, and should we attribute this to man and his doings and nature itself? Nevertheless, there's a sort of theme that we can see throughout American literature and throughout the American tradition here on page 16. The everyman, the second in command, the good-natured man without authority, the first mate, rivaling the captain, who is who's sort of pompous, who has little care for others, who who's using his authority only for his own benefit. This good-natured and caring second in command is able to convince the rest of the crew against the captain to do what is right. And the everyman's triumph over the captain leads to the salvation of an innocent bystander who happens to fall into some circumstance that is extraordinary but also disastrous for him. There are many themes that we could talk about that are in Tocqueville that sort of apply to this. But charity, right? Self-interest rightly understood and charity is what prevails here. And the first mate ends up saving both Augustus and Pym. On page 17 it goes on. Yet, as the reader has seen, both Augustus and myself were rescued, and our deliverance seemed to have been brought about by two of those almost inconceivable pieces of good fortune which are attributed by the wise and pious to the special interference of Providence. So here on page 17, we have Pym talking again about Providence and good fortune. He attributes their salvation not only to the goodness of these men, but to Providence and good fortune. Which is it? But it's not only good luck, or good luck is good luck and good fortune and providence not only protects their lives and leads to their salvation, leads to their rescue, but it also leads to a perfectly happy ending, sort of happily ever after. Not only are they saved, but they don't even get in trouble. These boys don't even get in trouble for running off for a midnight frolic in the boat. On page 21, at the very end of the chapter, both Augustus and myself managed to appear at Mr. Barnard's in time for breakfast, which luckily was somewhat late owing to the party overnight. I suppose all at the table were too much fatigued themselves to notice our jaded appearance. Of course, it would not have borne a very rigid scrutiny. Schoolboys, however, can accomplish wonders in the way of deception. And I verily believe not one of our friends in Nantucket had the slightest suspicion that the terrible story told by some sailors in the town of their having run down a vessel at sea and drowned some 30 or 40 poor devils had reference either to the Ariel, my companion, or myself. So it's interesting. Schoolboys, however, can accomplish wonders in the way of deception. Okay, what are we to make of this? Is this a general characterization of Pym and of Augustus? Is he remarking about his ability to sort of tell stories and trick people? Or is this just a sort of general statement? What are we to make of this? The other interesting thing about truthfulness, verity, is the boat, the people who were on the boat who saved the Penguins shipmen, they return to the town and they tell a terrible story about having run down a vessel at sea and drowned some 30 or 40 poor devils. So there's a sort of tale within the tale going on here as well. Nevertheless, they take a lesson from this, both Augustus and Pym. We too have since very frequently talked the matter over, but never without a shudder. In one of our conversations, Augustus frankly confessed to me that in his whole life he had at no time experienced so excruciating a sense of dismay as when on board our little boat he first discovered the extent of his intoxication and felt himself sinking beneath its influence. So happily ever after. The first chapter ends with very stupid decisions by these boys in a drunken stupor. They're both saved physically. They don't die. They don't drown at sea. But they're also not even caught. So the question is, do they really learn their lesson? Should they have really learned their lesson? Do we want Pym and Augustus to be more careful going forward? On to chapter 2. So, for whatever reason, after this first frolic at sea, Pym hasn't gotten enough. Here is an etching of the boat that they later embark on, Pym and Augustus, and here is an etching of Pym and Augustus, someone made in the 19th century to accompany this text. For whatever reason, Pym decides that he wants more of this taste of the ocean. On page 22, it says, "It is strange, too, that he most strongly enlisted my feelings in behalf, Augustus, strongly enlisted my feelings in behalf of the life of a seaman, when he depicted his more terrible moments of suffering and despair. For the bright side of the painting, I had a limited sympathy. My visions were of shipwreck and famine, of death or captivity among barbarian hordes, of a lifetime dragged out in sorrow and tears, upon some gray and desolate rock, in an ocean unapproachable and unknown." So Augustus continues to tell Pym these stories of the sea, and it's interesting. Pym is very captivated by the stories of disasters at sea. He has limited sympathy for the bright side of the painting, and he has visions of shipwreck and famine, death or captivity among barbarian hordes. Why is this? It's very interesting. He wants most to have the sort of adventures that will even lead to disaster. What are we to say of this? Why does Pym have visions for shipwreck and famine and the more terrible moments of suffering? Perhaps this can be related back to the Tocqueville quote from that I brought up in the preface. Americans have a deep fear for the normal, the average, and the unexciting. Freedom yearns for excitement and adventure, even if it comes at the cost of trauma. Go west, young man. The point of departure in Tocqueville, right? The settlers of America, they decide to embark for the new nation, and they know that it's going to be a rough experience, but they're willing to trade the rough experience for the possibility of some great adventure or some promised happier tomorrow. This tendency, Tocqueville seems to argue, is sort of woven into the American character. But Americans also want to believe that their destiny is more than just a desk job. On page 23, it says, such visions or desires, for they amounted to desires, are common. I have since been assured, to the whole numerous race of the melancholy among men. At the time of which I speak, I regarded them only as the prophetic glimpses of a destiny which I felt myself in a measure bound to fulfill. Augustus thoroughly entered into my state of mind. It is probable, indeed, that our intimate communion had resulted in a partial interchange of character. So he regards these sort of visions of shipwreck and famine as sort of prophetic glimpses of a destiny, which he felt himself in a measure bound to fulfill. He thinks it's his destiny to go to sea and to live a life that's more than just mediocre, that's exciting, that's filled with adventure. And Pym even says that he's been assured that the whole numerous race of the melancholy among men have the same sort of vision or desire. Is this a good desire? So going forward, um, he begins to talk to his family about this. Mr. Pym begins to talk to his family about this. His father doesn't really care, but his grandfather and his mother are very worried that he's going to end up going to sea. But it's said that he says that this only adds fuel to the flame on page 24. Um, on page 24, he has some regrets. Pym has some regrets about the way that he treats his family. He says, quote, I have since frequently examined my conduct on this occasion with sentiments of displeasure as well as of surprise. The intense hypocrisy I then made use of for the furtherance of my project, an hypocrisy pervading every word and action of my life for so long a period of time, could only have been rendered tolerable to myself by the wild and burning expectation with which I looked forward to the fulfillment of my long-cherished visions of travel. The question is, why does he take himself to be a hypocrite? Why does he regret or why does he feel guilty about this sort of scheme of deception? Well, for whatever reason he feels the guilt of this, he says that it's worth it to fulfill his long-cherished visions of travel. So the desire for adventure trumps any sort of conscious objections to duping his family. Um, Nevertheless, Augustus convinces Pym to finally go to embark with him on a ship. Pym is going to be a stowaway, and then after they get far enough out to where Pym can't be caught by his parents and returned back to Nantucket, then he's going to jump out and he's going to become a member of this crew before it's too late to return him back home. But he's almost caught. Grandpa almost catches him when he's going out to become a stowaway on this ship. Um, so he's wearing this sort of cloak, this raggedy cloak, and Augustus is taking him to the ship, and he's about to go to his quarters, and he's stopped by Grandpa on the street. Um, and Grandpa asks what he's doing out in the street. And Pym replied, assuming as well as I could the exigency of the moment, an air of offended surprise, and talking in the gruffest of all imaginable tones. Sir, you are a somewhat mistaken. My name, in the first place, bean't nothing at all like Gooden, and I'd want you to know for better, you blackguard, than to call my new overcoat a dirty one. For my life I could hardly refrain from screaming with laughter at the odd manner in which the old gentleman received his handsome rebuke. He started back 2 or 3 steps, turned first pale and then excessively red, threw up his spectacles, then, putting them down, ran full tilt at me with his umbrella uplifted. He stopped short, however, in his career, as if struck by a sudden recollection, and presently turning round, hobbled off down the street, shaking all the while with rage and muttering between his teeth, Won't do! New glasses! I thought it was Gordon. Damn, good-for-nothing saltwater Long Tom. So he deceives his grandfather. Pym deceives his grandfather when he's about to be arrested by his grandfather while he's going off to be a stowaway on this ship. And he doesn't seem to have any remorse now. He can hardly refrain from screaming with laughter. Why is it that he feels no remorse when he is actually duping his grandfather? But he states earlier on that he feels great remorse or guilty of hypocrisy. It's interesting to ponder. We'll skip ahead a little bit to when Pym finally gets on the ship. He's shown to his quarters what Augustus does is he's sort of laid some carpet over a piece of the wood which he has carved out with a nail sticking underneath, and that's a sort of latch that the stowaway, Mr. Pym, will go into. And underneath there, it's a sort of storage compartment with a bunch of junk there that Augustus has arranged particularly in order to conceal this little cell that he's put at the back, which is like a shipping crate, and it has a bed in it, and it has some meat and some water that's going to hold Pym over for the next couple of days while they're at sea. On page 29, Pym is introduced to his new shelter, his new cell, his whatever you want to call it, and he proceeded immediately to take possession of his little apartment, and this with feelings of higher satisfaction, I am sure, than any monarch ever experienced upon entering a new palace. Why is Pym so satisfied with this basically holding cell with a mattress in it? Well, it's his property. It's his first home. It's his first thing that he can call his own. It's not his father's. That's not his grandfather's. Um, it's his palace. And this palace, it signals freedom. This new home that is his, that he's going to live in for a few days, he can call it completely his own, and it signals freedom. This is the place that he will own and where he can exercise his freedom. However, this feeling is quite short-lived. Going on a few pages, Pym soon becomes terrified. He has to wait down in this little holding cell for Augustus to come back and tell him that it's safe to emerge from below board. And it's not only that he gets bored, he becomes terrified. He accuses Augustus of the grossest inattention because Augustus isn't checking up on him enough. Augustus finally comes and visits him and gives him a pocket watch. But throughout this process, Pym is trying to sort of make sense of what's going on, even though he can't see anything. There's not even any light below this deck for him to see anything. He's just sort of stuck in this room. And Pym is sitting here thinking on page 33, besides granting that we were still in the neighborhood of the island, why should not Augustus have visited me and informed me of the circumstance? Pondering in this manner upon the difficulties of my solitary and cheerless condition, I resolved to wait yet another 24 hours, when, if no relief were obtained, I would make my way to the trap, and endeavor to hold a parley with my friend, or get at least a little fresh air through the opening, and a further supply of water from his stateroom. While occupied with this thought, however, I fell, in despite of every exertion to the contrary, into a state of profound sleep or stupor. So, he's going to go retrieve some water. He's going to go talk to his friend, Augustus. But then he gets so tired that he falls asleep. And what happens? My dreams were of the most terrific description. Every species of calamity and horror befell me. Among other miseries, I was smothered to death by huge pillows, by demons of the most ghastly and ferocious aspect. Immense serpents held me in their embrace, and looked earnestly in my face with their fearfully shining eyes. Then deserts limitless, and of the most forlorn and awe-inspiring character, spread themselves out before me. Immensely tall trunks of trees, gray and leafless, rose up in endless succession as far as the eye could reach. Their roots were concealed in wide-spreading morasses, whose dreary water lay intensely black, still and altogether terrible beneath, and the strange trees seemed endowed with a human vitality, and, waving to and fro their skeleton arms, were crying for the silent waters for mercy, in the shrill and I don't have the second page here, so let's jump over to the lecture. In the shrill and piercing accents of the most acute agony and despair, the scene changed, and I stood naked and alone amid the burning sand plains of Sahara. At my feet lay crouched a fierce lion in the tropics. Suddenly his wild eyes opened and fell upon me. With a convulsive bound he sprang to his feet and laid his bare, horrible teeth. In another instant there burst from his red throat a roar like the thunder of the firmament, and I fell impetuously to the earth, stifling In a paroxysm of terror, I at last found myself partially awake. My dream, then, was not all a dream. Now at least I was in possession of my senses, of some huge real monster were pressing heavily upon my bosom. His hot breath was in my ear, and his white and ghastly fangs were gleaming upon me through the gloom. So he has this dream, and this dream conveys all kinds of different depictions of nature as savage and chaotic. It would be worthwhile to sort of analyze all of the different scenes that he sees in his dream, but we don't quite have time for that, so that's something that you can do on your own time. But nevertheless, this is another great depiction of sort of Gothic narrative. We'll see similar depiction of place and of nature in Sleepy Hollow, in Moby Dick. This is typical of the 19th century and romantic literature in the 19th century, and this is a particular great example of American Gothic depiction of nature and romantic literature. But there's a real monster when he awakes, breathing upon him, and he's terrified. So why is he so terrified? Not to get too Freudian here, but why is he having these sort of bad dreams? It seems to me that this palace, this room that was a palace, is actually a sort of prison to him. He's in fact not free at all. He does not control his own destiny. This is just like on the Ariel in the previous chapter. He can't do anything. He's completely stripped of freedom and self-reliance. There's nothing that he can do to save himself, and this sort of bubbles up in these bad dreams where nature is this sort of savage thing that's going to overcome him. He has to rely entirely on the techne, again, of the crew and of Augustus. There's nothing he can do but sit and worry about what might go wrong, and that worry festers and becomes these bad dreams. He lacks agency. But there's this huge monster when he awakes. What could this huge monster be, and why is it pressing heavily upon his bosom, and what's it going to do? He cries to God in one last strong effort. It states on page 34, had 1,000 lives hung upon the movement of a limb or the utterance of a syllable, I could have neither stirred nor spoken. The beast, whatever it was, retained his position without attempting any immediate violence, while I lay in an utterly helpless and, I fancied, a dying condition beneath him. I felt that my powers of body and mind were fast leaving me. In a word, that I was perishing, and perishing of sheer fright. My brain swam, I grew deadly sick, my vision failed. Even the glaring eyeballs above me grew dim. Making a last strong effort, I at length breathed a faint ejaculation to God and resigned myself to die. What happens? It turns out that it's just his dog, Tiger, his Newfoundland dog, Tiger, and then Tiger begins licking his face. Pym, of course, becomes overjoyed because he's not going to die, but he's still worried about what's going on, so he decides to leave his little stowaway prison cell and go above board, but he realizes that he's entombed. First, he tries to navigate his way via the string that Augustus has connected up to the hatch so that he can go above board. He whacks his head on a steel storage crate on the way. Then he has to move it. He manages to move it by hook and by crook. Then he gets to the hatch and he realizes the hatch is stuck. So he is really entombed, as he says, imprisoned down below. He returns to his little cell and he resolves that he's just going to have to sit and await his fate in this tomb. This is, by the way, something that Poe draws upon all the time in his stories. If you've read any Poe, this is like the greatest fear for Edgar Allan Poe. Being entombed, being trapped underground, having no way out. This is like the American Gothic fear, with its culmination of being buried alive, which Poe writes a story about. Anyway, so he goes back to his little cell. He finds Tiger. Tiger's licking him for comfort, but Tiger keeps laying on his back. And Pym begins to realize that maybe Tiger's hurt. So he starts feeling around on his paws, feeling around on his head, and then he feels around on his back, and there's sort of a patch of hair, but there's and he thinks that this might be a wound, but that patch of hair that's standing up is just a string that goes around Tiger's belly, and there's a note attached to it. And that is the end of chapter 2. And you have to read the rest of the novel to figure out what the rest of it is about. So I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.